then?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, great. Hello everyone, and this is with great pleasure that we introduce you today Dr. Sabrina Inowlocki. Sabrina is a classicist focusing on late antique literature and history. After a doctorate on Eusebius of Caesarea and his use of Jewish authors published at Brill, she has conducted her postdoctoral research at Oxford, Jerusalem, and Harvard. She has published on early Christian authors, Eusebius and Philo. She is notably the co-editor of a collected volume on Philo of Alexandria and another one on Eusebius. Do you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Great. Last November, she joined the KU Leuven as a Marie Curie Fellow. Her new project deals with late antique collective biographies, notably the Uiris Illustribus from Jerome to Isidore of Seville. In addition, she is currently working on a monograph on scribes and scholars in late antiquity, focusing on Pamphilus of Caesarea. So, Sabrina, thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuval. Boker Tov. Hello, everyone. First of all, let me just give a few thanks. I want to thank the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters for inviting me, especially Michal, and thank you for Yuval for helping me with all kind of technological things. So today I'm going to speak to you about my new project. I slightly changed the title from Caesarea to Marseille, the regionalization of literary history in the Christian De Viris Illustribus. So for starters, I want to say a few words about this project. So it's a project that deals with the rise of a Christian literary culture beyond the Bible, focusing on the Christian De Viris Illustribus that were written in late antiquity. So these De Viris Illustribus, what are they? They are biobibliographical catalog of Christian authors that emerged in the 4th century. And they are sort of the Facebook/academia and also even Wikipedia of late antiquity, because the social networks are very important in those works. They trace specific social networks, and also they're a little bit similar to Wikipedia because of their ever-expanding encyclopedic character. More seriously, I focus notably in my research on Eusebius of Caesarea, Jerome, Gennadius, and later I hope to be able to focus also on the Isidore of Seville and Ildefonso of Toledo. And I want to focus on their impact on late antique and early medieval culture and society. My interest in studying these works concerns larger questions such as how is knowledge made, contested, authorized, and used with particular regard to historical, cultural, religious, and political processes. In my research, I consider them not only as sources of information, as informative biobibliographical catalogs, but rather as intellectual, literary, theological inventories reflecting late antique culture. I argue that they both shaped and were shaped by the social, political, cultural environment in which they were composed, which I will try to show today through some small examples. Although these writings provide invaluable information not only on the authors they present, but also on the culture and society of their time, they are still often relegated to the periphery of scholarship. This was not the case in the past. Jerome's De Viris Illustribus was immensely popular, notably providing the template for the uomini famosi of the Renaissance. So I guess that today talking about this De Viris Illustribus in this seminar is in itself already saying something on center and periphery. As the significance of these writings still needs to be recognized, through this project, I hope to start a conversation about them that will bring them back a little bit to the center where they used to be for more than 1,000 years. In the framework of this seminar, I have looked at these texts in order to find out what they can tell us in terms of late antique perceptions of center and periphery, the subject of the seminar, and whether their organization betrays a concern for this question. This, in turn, has led me to analyze the geographically differentiated ways in which different knowledge claims emerge, become institutionalized, canonized, and/or traveled in these texts. In particular, I have focused on how different centers of knowledge, which I will refer to as lieux de savoir in this paper. So lieux de savoir, places of knowledge, is an expression made by Christian Jacob, based on Pierre Nora's famous lieux de mémoire. And they refer to places of intellectual activity and how knowledge and literary and textual activities are really made in practice. So I want to focus on these lieux de savoir and on how they gained ascendancy in and through the De Viris Illustribus, especially in relation to religious phenomena such as monasticism and asceticism. Now, before we start, because I understand that not everybody here is focuses on this period, I want to give a brief presentation of these works. First, some of you may wonder why my title includes Caesarea, since no known De Viris Illustribus has emerged from this Palestinian city in late antiquity. From my perspective, these works cannot be fully understood without including Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica as a prehistory to Jerome and his followers. Indeed, the Historia Ecclesiastica of Eusebius, redacted someplace between 300 and 325, I'm not entering into the details here, includes a vast biobibliographical catalogue of Christian authors, the first one in fact, fragmented throughout the work. Eusebius presumably heavily drew on the resources of the library of Caesarea that had been gathered by his teacher Pamphilus around the nucleus of Origen's works. Eusebius' project differs from that of his followers because Eusebius' catalogue was modeled after pagan philosophical lives. Presumably, Porphyry's Vita Plotini comes to mind, Diogenes Laertius, Philostratus, while Jerome was following a different path. Even though he claimed to counter Porphyry and Emperor Julian's claim that there were no philosophers among the Christians, his lives, oscillating between the discourses of theology and literary criticism, were literary lives modeled after Suetonius and other predecessors. As Salvatore Pricoco has pointed out, in the original part of the De Viris Illustribus, because the first part is modeled after Eusebius and the second part is with Jerome's own research, Jerome clearly sacrifices doctrinal and philosophical content to an essentially literary perspective. Jerome, nevertheless, largely relied on Eusebius for the composition of his own De Viris Illustribus. The first 78 authors, and I will now show you, I will switch to the, we'll give you this is the content of his De Viris Illustribus. So the first 78 authors use Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica as a source, but the Historia is not only a source for Jerome. His own De Viris Illustribus is also, in some sense, a continuation of Eusebius' catalogue, with only 57 entries representing his own original work. It is worth noting that Jerome made the choice not to translate the Historia Ecclesiastica, as he had done with the Onomasticon and the Chronicle, but rather to extract from the Historia its biobibliographical information in order to turn it into a Latin Roman textual object. This was a bold, original, Hieronymian move for this non-identified literary object, to which Jerome strikingly proves reluctant to give a definite title in a letter to Augustine, would become tremendously influential in the West, both spreading Greek knowledge and ushering in a literary historical tradition that would lead to both patrology and patristics and later to national literary histories. Jerome's De Viris Illustribus was written in Latin between 392 and 93 in Bethlehem, before the Origenist controversy broke out. It is a gift to one Dexter in the 14th year of Theodosius I's reign. This Dexter is mentioned in the De Viris Illustribus And funnily enough, Jerome tells us that he hasn't read the work that he sent him. So the work includes entries for 135 authors, starting with Simon Peter and ending with Jerome himself. Jerome's De Viris Illustribus has been continuously copied and expanded, surviving in 176 manuscripts, the earliest of which dates to the 6th century. This is only slightly later than Gennadius of Marseille continuation of Jerome's De Viris Illustribus, which dates to the late 5th century. Gennadius' text, and I also have a little table of this content. Gennadius' text includes 91 entries, covering the 4th and the 5th century, Greek and Latin theological writers, so basically from Jerome's death to his own time. The two works tended to travel together, this is important, with Jerome's work presented as the first part of a larger De Viris Illustribus, of which Gennadius was the second part. Gennadius' catalogue has unjustly generally been taken as a simple extension of Jerome's rather than a work in its own right. In fact, it is not so, and it has its own specific features, a greater focus on monastic culture and doctrinal matters, influenced by semi-Pelagianism, that is, Massilian anti-Augustinian controversy. It lacks a preface of its own, which shows it was destined to be materially continuous with the Jerome's De Viris Illustribus. Some notes in this text are considered inauthentic, made by an interpolator, presumably of the 7th century. And now I would like to start dealing with the topic of the seminar. But before this, still, I would like to briefly expose also the way in which I understand the projects of our three authors. So a little bit more of a background on this. First of all, these works, they offer like literary textual galleries of portraits of Christian authors. And I choose my words in this context. For Jerome, there is a strong connection between the books and authors and what's called in Latin imagines, the iconographic portraits of the authors, whether sculpted or drawn as miniatures in some texts like Varro's Imagines. As Marc Vesey has pointed out, and I quote, to be a classic in the Roman sense meant to hold a place in a gallery of portraits visited by educated persons across the empire. Modeled partly on aristocratic traditions of ancestor worship, this visual discursive space of honorable memory was open from the start to new talent and subject to continuous restructuring over the centuries, end quote. Our De Viris Illustribus are one of such restructuring at the end of the 4th century, at least Jerome's. While emperors inscribed their presence through monuments throughout the empire, Christian writers such as Jerome and Gennadius inscribed their own presence in the Christian culture of their time through the cataloging of textual and literary monumenta, a word used by Jerome in this context. In a sense, these De Viris Illustribus aim to propose sort of a canon of the Christian classics, but an open, ever-expanded one. The second point I want to make is that the De Viris Illustribus, Christianizing a pagan genre, redefine what it means to be an author. While for Eusebius, and I have here a little comparison to show, this is the introduction of the Historia Ecclesiastica and then Jerome's preface. So you see in Eusebius, I have purpose to record in writing the successions of the sacred apostles, covering the period stretching from our Savior to ourselves. The number of those, so he's also going to record the number of those who in each generation were the ambassadors of the word of God, either by speech or by pen. And by speech or by pen translates agraphos, ekai diasum grammaton, so unwritten or through writings. And then Jerome, Dexter, you urge me, oh, I have a little problem here, just a second. I need to, okay. Dexter, you urge me that I, following the example of Tranquillus, that is Suetonius, prepare an orderly presentation of the ecclesiastical writers and do for our writers what he did in chronicling eminent Gentile authors, that is, that I set forth for you a brief treatment of all those who have published anything memorable, which can also be translated who have transmitted something for posterity, on the Holy Scriptures, from the time of Christ's Passion down to the 14th year of the Emperor Theodosius. So, while for Eusebius, an author is defined quite vaguely as an ambassador of the divine logos, whether in writing or not, from Jerome on, to be an author was whoever makes memory or transmits to posterity something about the sacred scriptures. In Latin, omnes qui de scripturis sanctis memoriae aliquid prodiderunt. So to comment on scriptures. Thus, Jerome and Gennadius contributed to a redefinition of the author as a sort of grammarian, to use an expression from Vesey's works, a Christian counterpart of the humbly erudite Servian. Hello? Yet, this Christian interpreter was destined to become, through the De Viris Illustribus, a new sort of holy man, to resume the words of Peter Brown. Jerome himself calls it a catalogue of saints, in catalogo sanctorum, in his own De Viris Illustribus. Neither Jerome nor Gennadius puts a special emphasis on miracles or healings of any sort, and this will change in later De Viris Illustribus. But their scholarship on scripture, combined with their status as martyrs or bishops or monks, bestowed on them a new kind of authority, a Christian authority. And we finally reach now the core of the subject of this paper, Center and Periphery, and the regionalization of knowledge. And I will start with Eusebius, and then we'll go to Jerome, and we will finish with Gennadius. As Robert Wilken has pointed out, Eusebius, I quote, directed attention for the first time in Christian history to the religious and theological significance of space, end quote. There would, of course, be much to say here about his views of Jerusalem and Palestine, Constantinople, both from Jewish and Christian point of view, but this would carry me too far, as I will restrict my views here on the catalogue itself. Suffice it to remind ourselves here that it is the 4th century that sacred history was spatially projected on the holy sites of Palestine and other sites of the Roman Empire. But if we concentrate on the Historia Ecclesiastica, we can only agree with James Cork Webster's recent conclusion that ultimately the Historia Ecclesiastica aims to demonstrate that Christianity was always the empire's natural heir. The rise of the church as a new universal power under Constantine was its main concern, as well as the coincidence between the success of the Roman power and the success of Christianity. Eusebius uses Psalm 45, 9, 10, for example, in order to praise the new peace that now extended to the extremities of the earth, and he did emphasize the presence of churches in the whole inhabited world. Universality was also a feature of his biobibliographical catalogue. From Bardizan's Syriac writings to Clement of Rome, Tertullian in North Africa, and through Pantinus in India, it is clear that Eusebius was also keen to put on display the universality of its written production, and this from the very start of the Historia Ecclesiastica. Yet, the chronological dimension eclipses the spatial dimension. As is well known, the construction and presentation of lineages, both philosophical and theological, is another crucial feature of the Historia Ecclesiastica. Lineage implies above all a vertical, chronological connection between an origin and a destination, developed through time. His literary catalogue is also somehow one long lineage, starting from Philo, who is in fact the first real literary entry in the Historia, and ending with Eusebius himself, since the last quotation is his own, and it's the last and the longest of the Historia Ecclesiastica. This diachronic catalogue, built in part on the Chronicle, includes not only many authors' biobibliographies, but also their opinions on biblical canon, as well as on the books they have read, their connections with other authors, who cites who has read what. Therefore, more than a lineage, it is in many respects a network in which both places and individuals could easily be represented as interconnected dots on a map. In such a configuration, space obviously has nevertheless a major role to play. A notable example to explore this question is the location of the origins of Egyptian Christianity among the Jewish Therapeutae in the vicinity of Alexandria. From this community described by Philo in his De Vita Contemplativa, so that this community who was supposedly born from the followers of Mark, a connecting line is drawn through the members of the catechetical school of Alexandria, Pantinus, Clement, Origen, to the city of Caesarea, where Origen settled after his departure from Alexandria. From there, Pamphilus, Eusebius' beloved teacher and colleague, links Origen's teaching to Eusebius himself. In this case, ecclesiastical, doctrinal, and authorial politics converge to trace a major geographic connection between Alexandria and Caesarea. Strikingly, when Eusebius presents Origen's biobibliography in Book 6, he draws a distinction between the works he composed in Alexandria and those he composed in Caesarea. This, I would argue, allows him to promote his native Caesarea as a new Christian lieu de savoir. Thus, even if the structure of the catalogue is above all chronological, there's already some sort of valorization of regional knowledge in the Historia. In many respects, the transition of Christian knowledge through the person of Origen from Alexandria to Caesarea is treated both diachronically and translocally by Eusebius. The question now is, what did Jerome did with that information? So we now pass to Jerome. And I will start with a citation also from Marc Vesey. It was no part of Jerome's purpose to demonstrate the geographical distribution of Christian learning and eloquence, nor could he have done so without disrupting the chronological order of a list which was designed to culminate in his own current activity as a Christian writer in the 14th year of the Emperor Theodosius. End quote. Marc Vesey is right when Jerome's De Viris Illustribus is compared to that of Gennadius, as we shall discover soon. However, even though he does not use geography as an ordering principle in his catalogue, unlike his successor, by other aspects, he does enhance the authority of some specific spaces and places as lieu de savoir. First of all, it is worth noting that the choice of the De Viris Illustribus itself betrays the ongoing importance of Rome as cultural metropolis and Romanitas. And I show this through 3 points. The first one, although he mentions some Greek biobibliographical models, the De Viris Illustribus is a typically Roman genre of which Jerome himself acknowledges Suetonius is the primary example. Second, the addition of Seneca among the scriptores ecclesiastici, and here you note that when he adds Seneca to his list, it's in the part where he takes all the information from the Historia Ecclesiastica. Seneca was not in Eusebius. He doesn't put him at any place between any Christian writers. He makes sure to insert him between Josephus and Philo, which is no coincidence, because they are the only non-Christian exceptions with Justus of Tiberias in the catalogue. So the addition of Seneca in the part where he closely follows Eusebius is also telling, of course. Although he's from Cordoba and not Rome, Seneca is a major figure of Roman literary culture. His iconic status among Latin-speaking Christians is undeniable and is also attested by Tertullian, who calls him Seneca saepien noster, our forever Seneca. His inclusion in the De Viris Illustribus betrays Jerome's attempt to Romanize, sort of, Eusebius' Greek model. Seneca's supposed epistolary exchanges with Paul allowed him to firmly tie biblical and Latin Roman literary cultures. And the third little point, it's a small point and there are many others, but I just selected this one, is the next entry that is devoted to Josephus, so another non-Christian ecclesiastic scriptor.
Sorry, Sabrina, did you mean to change slides or stay on Eusebius and Jerome?
No, I'm gonna stay there for the moment.
Okay, sorry.
That's fine. So in this other entry, he stresses Josephus' cultural success at Rome, as attested, for example, by his statue in Rome and the place of his books in the libraries of Rome. Eusebius also had mentioned this information, but in Jerome, it is located at the very beginning of Josephus' entry, which shows the emphasis on this point. Therefore, Rome as a cultural force plays from the outset a major role in the De Viris Illustribus, albeit implicitly. It is both a centrifugal and a centripetal force in Jerome. It underpins, on the one hand, a cultural deterritorialization of Eastern Greek knowledge and its reterritorialization in the Western Latin Roman-speaking world. On the other, Jerome's own individual deterritorialization from Rome and Roman culture and his reterritorialization in the East. And I congratulate myself for saying this word reterritorialization without any hesitancy. In this context, what does Jerome do with his own geographical position at Bethlehem? While in other writings, his adulation of Bethlehem shows occasionally in proud references to his little village, in the De Viris Illustribus, the only reference appears in the entry that precedes his own, devoted to Sophronius, his translator, that he describes as a man of superlative learning who wrote, while yet a lad, in praise of Bethlehem. The fact that he makes sure to mention this œuvre de jeunesse is surely a nod to his beloved home place. However, it is not depicted as a lieu de savoir, and its humble rusticitas leads to its quasi-omission. By contrast, Caesarea, which embodies in an epistle 108, the thriving Christian city, is mentioned no less than 19 times in the De Viris Illustribus. And just to give you a comparison, it is mentioned, Jerusalem is mentioned 20 times, Rome 46, Alexandria 35, Antioch 27. Unsurprisingly, it always shows up in relation to the Caesarean lineage Eusebius had established in the Historia, so Origen, Pamphilus, Eusebius. Noticeably, Jerome made sure to also add Acacius, Euzoius, and Gelasius, 3 bishops who had succeeded Eusebius at the See of Caesarea. A most striking passage is the entry devoted to Pamphilus, Eusebius' teacher that we have already met, and the founder of the famous library. And now I'm going to put the text. Pamphilus the presbyter, intimate friend of Eusebius, bishop of Caesarea, was so inflamed with love of the sacred library that he transcribed the greater part of the works of Origen with his own hand. And these are still preserved in the library at Caesarea. I have 25 volumes of commentaries of Origen written in his hand on the 12 prophets, which I hug and guard with such joy that I deem myself to have the wealth of Croesus. And if it is such joy to have one epistle of a martyr, how much more to have so many thousand lines, which seem to me to be traced in his blood. He wrote an apology for Origen before Eusebius had written his, and was put to death at Caesarea in Palestine in the persecution of Maximinus. End quote. I quote this passage because it really stands out in the De Viris Illustribus, as it is the one in which Jerome is mostly personally involved. Of course, Jerome interferes many times in his own name in this work, but here it's really personal. It reveals how Jerome articulates his own persona to the school of Caesarea, manifesting how in Caesarea, his own library, his own book collection becomes intertwined with both the divine library, that is scriptures, and the library of Caesarea through the connection of Pamphilus' scribal work. If Caesarea and its library are clearly promoted as a Christian lieu de savoir, this savoir, it's true, is most clearly embodied by the scholars who inhabit that intellectual space. Pamphilus is in this respect a major figure, whose library, books, and own blood are forever connected to Caesarea, both as a lieu de savoir, but in this case, also as a lieu de mémoire, due to his martyrdom. The importance of Caesarea through Pamphilus is also witnessed in other occurrences of Caesarea in the De Viris Illustribus. For example, in entry 3, devoted to Matthew, Jerome proudly mentions that the Hebrew text of Matthew, I quote, has been preserved until the present day in the library at Caesarea, which Pamphilus the martyr so diligently gathered, end quote. The sacred library is also mentioned in the entry devoted to Eusebius as the field of investigation of both Pamphilus the martyr and Eusebius Pamphyli, since Eusebius took the name of Pamphilus. And finally, at 113, Eusebius is said to have, I quote, preserved the holdings of the library of Origen and Pamphilus, which had greatly deteriorated, end quote. This is confirmed by the subscription found, by the way, in a medieval manuscript of Philo. Thus, the focus on Caesarea and its lineage of Christian scholars, Origen, Pamphilus, Eusebius, as constructed by Eusebius himself in the Historia Ecclesiastica, is not simply transferred into Jerome's De Viris Illustribus. It is appropriated by Jerome. By claiming ownership of textual copies of Origen, handwritten by Pamphilus the martyr, the jewel of Caesarea, as he was called, Jerome appropriates a small part of the intellectual prestige attached to Caesarea as a lieu de savoir. So this is for Jerome. And we will now reach our last author, Gennadius of Marseille. With Gennadius, we make a change of scene by moving to Gaul. His De Viris Illustribus presents the clearest case of the three authors presented here in terms of the use of the De Viris Illustribus as a tool to position his own place as a lieu de savoir on the Christian map. Indeed, even though Marseille had been an important hub harbor in antiquity since already the 6th century BC, from a cultural point of view, before the 4th century, Gaul was home only to isolated local aristocracies and a few Christians living outside southern Gaul. In the 5th century, however, Gaul became a busy place. Ralph Mathieson has described this change as the rise of the Christian church as the most significant social and cultural institution, the creation of barbarian kingdoms coupled with the final precipitous decline and the end of Roman authority, and the social world that was very much in flux as previously unprivileged social groups gained greater opportunities and means of self-expression changed the religious and political landscape, end quote. In the 5th century, Gallic Christianity rose to prominence, and Gennadius definitely participated in this change, notably by continuing Jerome's De Viris Illustribus. The 5th century seems to have been a time of literary re-evaluation for the educated elites in Gaul. In a letter to Claudianus Mamertus, Sidonius Apollinaris makes an interesting remark, and I quote, "For compared with you, the Varros and the Pliny's uncle and nephew will always seem provincial," end quote. This reversal between province and Rome, which is reversing the reality, that of Claudianus, a provincial far away from these Romans, both chronologically and geographically, is indicative of the attempt at shifting the Gallic province towards the center that Sidonius and, as we shall see now, Gennadius too attempt to achieve. Indeed, in this work, Gennadius only loosely follows a chronological order in his De Viris Illustribus, unlike Eusebius and Jerome. But he groups his authors according to subjects. For instance, a series of vignettes are arranged around Egyptian monks from 7 to 11, Augustine, and the characters that surround him, from 37 at 40. Then we have 2 Italian writers, 41, 42, followed by 4 Italian authors connected to the Pelagian controversy. And there is also a rather long section organized around the Nestorian controversy. At the beginning, there's also a cluster of authors of Egyptian monks. So the structuring is very different from that of Jerome and Eusebius. One of the most important features of Gennadius De Viris Illustribus compared to Jerome and Eusebius is his attention to the geographical coordinates, which guide his literary historiographical account. The specification of a writer's province or of his church, whether where he was ordained or where he had ecclesiastical office, is already a standard feature of Jerome's De Viris Illustribus, as well as Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica, and both conform to the model of classical biobibliographies in this respect. But Jerome does not particularly focus on the ethnic origin of his viri, and he does not emphasize their natio. In fact, he only once mentions Philo as natione Alexandrinus in 11. Unlike Jerome, Gennadius often refers to the natio, that is, the ethnicity, as a type of identifier, no less than 9 times. His Gallic colleagues all have their origin specified. Vigilantius presbyter natione Gallus, Vincentius natione Gallus apud monasterium Lerinensis insulae, Vincentius presbyter natione Gallus, Victorinus natione Aquitanicus, Cassianus natione Sita. There are problems there, but anyway, it mentions the natio. Strikingly, no one is described as Romanus. These forms of identification, which use both geographical and ethnic terminology to identify the subject characters, are revealing of a change in the apprehension of the spatial cultural landscape. This feature of the Gennadian De Viris Illustribus reflects a new trend in late antique Christianity, which promotes provinciality, as Marc Vesey has shown. Gaul becomes, in this context, the subject of special attention. Gennadius thus inscribes his work in a larger movement which promotes Gallic culture, emphasizing the Gallic provenance of his viri in order to promote the intellectual, cultural, theological authority of Gaul. Likewise, Claudian had referred to Gaul's learned citizens, and Symmachus praised Gallic eloquence. But Gennadius goes further than this. As we shall see now, he makes textual adjustments in order to emphasize the authority and prestige of the circle of Gallic intellectuals, as we shall see now. A good example is that of Gennadius' treatment of John Cassian, one of his favorite authors. So John Cassian from 360 to 435. Not only the entry for John Cassian is the second longest one in the De Viris Illustribus, but in the entry on Eucherius, he even labels him a saint, Sancti Cassiani. The appellation saint is rare in Gennadius, attached only to a few others, including James Paulinus of Nola, Martin of Tours, Cyprian, Stephen the First Martyr, Ephraim, etc. Augustine and Jerome, on the other hand, do not win this title. As Goodrich has pointed out in his work on John Cassian, it has long been assumed that he was intimately involved in some form of Massilian monastic project when he wrote his 2 great ascetic works, the Institutes and Collationes. But this biographical attribution, according to Goodrich, hangs on a single explicit piece of evidence, namely Gennadius' own assertion nearly half a century after John Cassian's death, that he had been a priest of Marseille and had established 2 monasteries in or near Marseille, apud Massilian presbyter condidit duo monasteria. And I will put the text for you. This is the text of the De Viris Illustribus. This is obviously a strong piece of evidence for Massilian provenance. But if Cassian was part of a Massilian ascetic monastic endeavor, it does not always fit with the rest of the evidence. For instance, Cassian fails to mention any of the bishops, priests, or monks of that city in any of his works, including Proculus, the powerful bishop of the city, in his dedications. This alone may suggest that Cassian was not in Marseille when he wrote his two ascetic treatises. Interestingly, Gennadius mentions Massilia twice in the entry on Cassian, once at the beginning and once at the end, a thing that he never does in other entries. So after the bibliographical list, and again, each time with the apud. This insistence may reveal Gennadius' involvement in a translatio of Cassian's literary legacy to Marseille, as Goodrich has suggested. What is important here for us is that if the Massilian location ascribed by Gennadius to Cassian must be challenged, then it means that Gennadius might have reworked the evidence in order to affiliate Cassian to his own city of Marseille. The claim that he had founded two monasteries in Marseille is the sort of claim we might expect from someone trying to create an illustrious past for a Massilian monastery, such as Gennadius. But it is not only through his supposed Massilian origins that Cassian is useful to this Gallic-centered point of view. Indeed, he is also used in other entries, and his text is reworked by Gennadius so as to fit his own agenda. So I now go to another example. Oh, I had put the entry on Leporius. Sorry, I made a mistake when I presented the text, but this is now the text anyway. So this is the case in the entry devoted to Leporius, a Gallic monk who had emphasized the distinction between two natures in Christ at the expense of the unity of his person. If we are to believe Augustine in Epistle 219 that was dated to 418-421, in 418, Augustine, bishop of Hippo, Florentius, bishop of Hippodiaritus, and Segundinus, a Numidian bishop, wrote to Proculus, bishop of Marseille, and Silenius, a bishop from elsewhere in southern France. The African bishops tell their Gallic counterparts that they welcomed the monk Leporius after he had been rebuked by the Gallic bishops and expelled from their country. That Leporius has read aloud the contents of the Libellus Emendationis, in which he repudiates his errors in Carthago, sometime apparently between May and June 418, before a synod of 4 bishops, and with them subscribed to its contents. This document was attached to Augustine's letter and forwarded to Proculus and Silenius to confirm Leporius' return to orthodoxy. And now I will show this because we are going to compare different texts and the translation is here for you. Gennadius' entry on Leporius documents this episode of doctrinal agreement between the Massilians and Augustine. According to Mark Vesey, Gennadius followed the first book of Cassian's De Garnatione Christi, identifying Leporius' Christological error as the outgrowth of Pelagian heresy. Yet, he does not clearly explain the theological link between Leporius' Pelagianism and his Christological error, as Cassian had, thereby obscuring a little bit the actual theological content of the affair. By contrast, Gennadius' entry sheds more light on the prosopographic aspects of this affair. According to Vesey, Gennadius, I quote, repersonalizes the process of the heretics' amendment, drawing attention to the individuals involved in the affair of Leporius and to their personal authority in matters of the faith, end quote. Where Cassian was keen to stress the idea of consensus omnium, saying that Leporius, I quote, was admonished by us and corrected by God, and a little bit further, that his confession was the faith of all Catholics, approved by all the bishops of Africa, whence he wrote, and by all those of Gaul, to whom he wrote. Gennadius specifies that the agents of his emendatio were in fact Augustine and the Doctores Gallicani. In Latin, a Gallicanis doctoribus admonitus, et in Africa per Augustinum adeo emendatus. He thus omitted completely the reference to the bishops. The effect of this seemingly small change is in fact more important than it seems. First, it conjures the image of a Gallic class of theological scholars independent of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, notably the bishops. As one of the implicit goals of his work may have been to show that the church's teaching authority did not rest with the bishops alone, this detail is quite telling. Second, it is perhaps no coincidence that Gennadius is vindicating the existence of a group of Gallic doctores, when Jerome himself had claimed to have written his own De Viris Illustribus against those who thought that the church could boast to have no doctores, qui putant ecclesiam nullos philosophos et eloquentes nullos habuisse doctores. For Gennadius, the question was no longer whether the church had doctores. Jerome had already amply proved that it did, but whether Gaul could boast to be a center of doctores, a lieu de savoir. The notice on Leporius aptly answers this question. Third, by placing these doctores alongside Augustine as authorities cooperating on the defense of orthodoxy, he promoted their doctrinal and intellectual authority, implicitly suggesting that they were Augustine's equals. Although Gennadius may have had his reserves concerning Augustine, who was semi-Pelagian, as his notice on the Bishop of Hippos subtly suggests, here his reputation was conveniently used at the service of the Gallic doctors. Fourth, as Christopher Blunda has suggested, due to the unclarity of the presentation of the theological issue in Gennadius, the cooperation between Augustine and the doctores now also included the opposition to Pelagius. Even though Pelagius, Celestius, and Julian were all identified as heretics in Gennadius' De Viris Illustribus, opposition to Augustine's views on original sin, the absolute gratuity of grace, and predestination still made Massilian views vulnerable to accusations of Pelagianism. Gennadius' portrayal of the Leporius affair as an episode of doctrinal cooperation could have contributed to shield the Massilian from such charges. Fifth, I would like to add to this dossier the letter of Augustine, which Gennadius might also have had in mind when he composed the notice on Leporius. Augustine had casted Proculus and Silenius as central figures in the Leporius affair. They had chastised Leporius and driven the monk out of Marseille. Cassian, as Goodrich notes, completely writes them out of the story, situating Leporius in a Gallic rather than a Massilian context. Cassian did not mention Silenius, Proculus, or Marseille in his version of the events. Gennadius followed Cassian, but still he did mention Augustine, and he may have known his epistle, but if he did, he omitted the three other African bishops, Aurelius Florentinus and Secundinus. It is worth noting, therefore, that Gennadius has not only shifted the focus from the bishops mentioned by John Cassian to the doctores, Augustine himself being conjured in his narrative as a doctor and not as a bishop. But he has also erased the three other African bishops mentioned by Augustine. Although Gennadius presents the Gallic doctores as a collectivity, it may have been only the bishops Proculus and Silenius mentioned by Augustine. Therefore, Gennadius has perhaps not only manipulated John Cassian's account, but also Augustine's, to the detriment of the African collegium now reduced to Augustine alone, but to the advantage of his Gallic group, then now appear as a strong community of scholars collaborating with Augustine alone. And here I made a little, where is it? A little table to clarify who appears where. So in Juncation, we had all the African bishops and all Gallic bishops. Augustine gave the names in the letter, and there are 4 African bishops and then the 2 Gallic bishops here, and Gennadius, only Augustine and the Gallic doctorates. It is certainly no coincidence that the notice devoted to Liporius introduces the members of the Gallici doctores in his catalogue: Cation of Marseille, Eucherius of Lyon, Vincent of Lerins, Salvian of Marseille, Hilary of Arles. By emphasizing the province of Gaul and Africa, but less so as we have seen, in the judgment of Leporius, Gennadius was redefining the geographical contours of the authoritative Christian lieu de savoir to the advantage of provincial Christianity, albeit less so for Africa than for Gaul, as we have just seen, maybe an implicit blow to the fief of Augustine. As Charles Pietri has pointed out, stressing the Regionalisierung der Kultur, the regionalization of culture, represented by Gennadius, I quote, Gennadius records the rise of a Gallic Christianity, especially its Massilian center, as represented by a circle of religious figures with strong monastic and presbyterial attachments, end quote. I would add that Gennadius does not only record the rise of Gallic Christianity, but he significantly and proactively contributes to shaping the contours of such a rise. A question that arises: does this regionalization somehow contradict the universality of the church and the authority of other regions? It does not. Gennadius subscribes to the vision of Vincent of Lerins, quod ubique, quod semper, quod ab omnibus. What we find in Gennadius is a new Latin Western phenomenon that marks the end of antiquity and ancient Christianity, the regionalization of knowledge. And I have now reached my conclusion. Although Eusebius and Jerome were not insensitive to the spatial dimensions of the mapping of Christian authorship, Gennadius clearly innovated, not only by using geographical considerations as an ordering factor, but also by promoting his own provincial corner of the Christian world. Gennadius, however, was not the only Gallic author to resort to the De Viris Illustribus in order to do so. A similar attempt, unrealized unfortunately, to write a De Viris Illustribus of the men from Belgica Prima had been attempted by Ausonius. This shift from a capital-mindedness to regionalization, from center to periphery, has been well described by Eric Auerbach. Even though Roman citizenship and education were distributed around the empire for Latin speakers such as Jerome, Rome remained the centripetal cultural center. Yet, he opposes the cultural map of the literati of the earlier Roman Empire to the insularity of the literatis' cultural life in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, during which literary life was split up into many little groups. According to Marc Vesey too, in spite of the myth of Rome as cultural metropolis, by the beginning of the 5th century, it ceased to be the automatic focus of Latin literary activity because the patterns of patronage had changed. What replaced the centrality of Rome after the creation of new imperial residences and prefectures as early as the end of the 3rd century, and the rise to prominence of some episcopal sees during theological controversies after Nicaea, was local literate groups federated by a common classical culture. Our De Viris Illustribus illustrate this shift particularly well, from Eusebius and Jerome, whose perspective remains largely chronological and universalist, to Gennadius, who clearly privileges his own local lieu de savoir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sabrina, for this fascinating talk. And I'm sure we have questions from the audience. So I suggest I see some virtual hands. And
I am trying to open up all the little windows, and I'm not very gifted. So, okay.
So I think Stephanie raised
Sabrina,
Perhaps we should stop sharing the screen.
Sabrina, can you stop sharing?
Yes, I stopped sharing. Ine. Ine. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so Stephanie, do you have a question?
לא, אין לי שאלה.
Okay. Okay, so this was clapping. If anyone has a question, please just feel free to unmute yourself and ask Sabrina.
Oded?
Yes, Professor Oded Irshai.
First of all, it's good to see you, Oded.
Hello, Sabrina. Thanks for this magnificent presentation. I have a small question. Did you sort of manage already to understand the mechanism of sifting, which Eusebius and Jerome did in the Viris Illustribus? Because there are other writers which never entered probably this catalog or were sidelined by them.
Can you just repeat your question? I haven't heard well.
Okay. My question is, did you manage to understand the mechanism by which Eusebius and Jerome sifted through whatever they found in archives? Because there might have been, or probably were, writers that never reached this catalog of the Viris Illustribus or were sidelined by these two. And the question is why and how many you can find that they might have known about and managed to ignore or overlook.
Well, I think that, yes.
Hi, I'm sorry that I'm without a camera, but I want to join Oded's question because I found it also extremely interesting to talk about what they include and what they don't. And I'm thinking more of other apologies of the time. Obviously, I'm thinking about rabbinic literature, but Oded's question is very interesting to me because I need more information about what they knew and how they knew and what he chose, and especially what they chose not to include and how to include. And what do you think? Do you see an organizing system to that? I really want to join with Oded, but expand it to other writers of the time and other considerations that might help us in deciphering what comes in and what comes out. And I thought, and again, I also want to join Oded in really a remarkable presentation with so much knowledge and information. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you. Well, I think there are two parts, two answers to that question. I think that one thing is the material aspect of their choice. You know, Eusebius certainly was dependent on his library, and a big part of how he chose must have been dependent on the material aspect of what was available to him. But of course, it's not all. We know in the catalog, we see that it did not only preserve so-called Orthodox authors, because there are also heretic authors that he keeps, such as Tatian or Bardesanis, Symmachus, that are not Orthodox. But so it's not only that he dropped unorthodox authors, but I think that there are two things. On the one hand, the unorthodox authors that he kept them, and this is a tendency that we will see also in Jerome and also in Gennadius, because they make a distinction between the men and their works. And there are works that they really want to keep, and there are works that they still read and encourage to read. And this is the case, for example, with Tatian. And so they still appear in their catalogs. And so I don't think the criteria of orthodoxy is enough to characterize this sifting. Also, Gennadius and Jerome also keep an Orthodox author. And by the way, like I said during the presentation, they keep Jewish authors, of course, special Jewish authors, but nevertheless. But they will drop, for example, Eusebius will not keep Methodius of Olympus because of his anti-originism. So I find that in a lot of respects, the Historia Ecclesiastica is conditioned by Eusebius' admiration for Origen, and the lineage with Alexandria and Caesarea is a major force behind the literary catalog. And but it's a very good question. In fact, it's a major question for my research: what has been kept and what has been dropped. What's interesting to see, I think, is that it's the way they perceive this catalog. All of them, they really see it as something open that will be open even by the format to additions. And so even though there are people that have dropped and that they don't want to consider and that are not included, it's still it's not a canon in the sense that it's going to be closed. And I find that very interesting. So in the case of Eusebius, we can see, I think, that on the one hand, his choice was probably conditioned by by what he materially had in his possession, and also by his, of course, by his own theological agenda. And this will be the case also with Jerome. And I have to say, I just started a project, so I need to dig into more for Gennadius. But obviously, this is a major point.
Okay, we have one more question from Jeremiah.
Wait, can I say one more sentence? Sorry.
Yes, Michal,
Sabrina, that I'll tell you why I'm piqued by Odette's question and your answer. We don't know when we get to rabbinic literature, right? It's also an anthology, right? They bring us all kinds of information, and we don't know how he got there. I'm thinking about the Babylonian Talmud, right? It could be random. It's some kind of a collection that's connected in some way. It can be associative collection to something that they're dealing with. And the only thing we can say is that if it's there, probably they had access to that. But we don't, sometimes you can say it looks like part of a bigger tractate or a bigger collection that we have. What's interesting about your material is that you mentioned a few ways of sifting, right? Because this is just heretical, this is not. I'm thinking of categories that might be applied to rabbinic literature as well, because it's an interesting question. What do you put in and what you don't? And especially for me as a historian, the question is, what do they have access to, and not necessarily what the final result is, right? Because they have other agendas when they decide to include or not. So I think we can learn a lot from scholarship such as yourself about the categories of sifting for other anthologies. And this is why I find this to be extremely fascinating. So thank you. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Michal. I have to say that I also asked myself the question, we need to talk. I need to talk about it. I would like to have a comparative point of view.
Gladly.
Okay.
Jeremiah, please.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. My question is, in a certain sense, the opposite side of the question that's just been asked. And it's about the things that are included, the writings that are mentioned in these projects that they don't have access to, that they don't have direct access to, that they have in various mediated ways. And my question is in part methodological. How can we tell what they know and what they're guessing or reconstructing based on other things that they have? Eusebius is perhaps the easiest here because sometimes we know he doesn't have the whole thing, or he'll mention what he has and what he doesn't. And it's almost certainly true that Jerome doesn't have everything he borrows from Eusebius. He hasn't read it. He's just trying to make sense of what he thinks Eusebius said. And I don't think he's always right. I don't know Gennadius nearly as well. But my question is, do you have thoughts on how they are these figures are thinking about the project of collecting knowledge about books that they don't have? What role do those figures and those books have in their bibliographic imagination if they don't actually have them in the library, if they don't have access to them?
That's a very good question. I don't have right now a very specific answer to give you, but what I can say is that I think even when they don't have, especially in Jerome and especially maybe even more so in Eusebius, is what they have is they have information on the networks. And so in the end, that's what matters to them, especially Eusebius. What has read what, who knows what, who cites what, where does it appear also? So maybe for the text that he doesn't have, that are not texts that are not in his library, or texts that he has seen, but maybe he doesn't own, maybe he doesn't have, he's read them before, but he doesn't materially have access to them. In the end, what's important is not that. In the end, what's important is their place in the network. And it's not only a network, it's not only a social network, it's really a book network. It's really like a librarian network. And so I suppose that this is the core of their interest, whether they really have, and I don't know, and that's a question that I ask myself too. To what extent does it matter if they own the book, if they have the book? Jerome, in his passage on Pamphilus, really insists on owning the book and touching it and having the blood of the martyr in his hands, or on his head almost. But that's because he turns the book into a relic almost. But apart from that, it's a good question. Does it matter if there are works that they use and that they mention and they don't really have access to them or own them? It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. I will think about it. Thanks. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Daniela.
Hi. Sorry. Thanks very much, Sabrina. I want to welcome all the guests to our seminar. I see many faces, some of them familiar and some unfamiliar, whom we haven't seen until now in our seminar. And this means you brought your gang of specialists with you, Sabrina, which is great, but leaves some of us behind, I'm afraid, because as you may know, ours is a very mixed group thematically. And so can I ask you, to address again the questions asked by Oded and Michal, but for those who are uninformed of the intellectual world of late antiquity or early Christianity, can you tell us a little bit more as a late introduction to what are not only geographically, but also thematically are the genres of the works included in those catalogs? Are they mainly theology? Do we find also history, martyrology, geography? I'm afraid, myself included, we're unfamiliar with many of the names on this catalog. So if you could map for us a little bit, and I excuse those who probably know, both the intellectual and also the geographical centers beyond those you've mentioned. And if I can go back to the epistle treated as relic, which I found really striking. Is this a very unusual comment you find in the sources, or does it reflect a wider attitude towards manuscripts? I mean, do you have other cases of this very physical connection with the actual object and its veneration as a relic of a martyr? This would be my second question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Daniela. So as for your first question, yes, it's true that I didn't really return to what is included, what kind of writings. So for Eusebius, in fact, I think that for Eusebius, it's a little bit difficult to delineate really, because there are two things in the Historia Ecclesiastica. On the one hand, there's like a real catalog, something that feels like a biobibliographical catalog that has been fragmented into small pieces, on a chronological skeleton. And these catalogs are really authors that include, it's rather, it's commentaries on scriptures, it's apologies, many apologies, but it's also historical with authors like Josephus, theological treatises, and a lot of material also about, like I said, about, not only commentaries, but also, the order of scripture and which author knows which author and the like. But you don't have really, like, for example, apocrypha. You have apocrypha, but you have very little narratives, for example. It's treatises. It's what Eusebius considers what we saw on in the presentation. The ambassadors of the Word of God, and in fact, when he says that it's rather vague, and in the Historia itself, you have this catalog, but in fact, everything almost in the Historia is part of the Historia itself is a big literary catalog, because, for example, you have long citations of narratives of martyrdom. And of course, that doesn't really enter the catalog as an entry, but it's clearly part of it. And because there are so many citations in the Historia Ecclesiastica, the whole Historia Ecclesiastica basically is a big literary history in some sense. And Jerome continues the same tendency, but he makes it more specific. It's really those who have written something, that transmitted something to posterity on scripture. So basically the material from Eusebius, plus after that, all kinds of commentaries and also polemical treatises and the like. And Gennadius continues that trend very clearly, but with a more doctrinal emphasis. Jerome is interested in the style of the authors, and he comments on the literary qualities. Gennadius he gives much more content on the doctrine and the theological aspects. So that's for your first question. And I welcome with much pleasure your second question, because I just wrote an article about this aspect, because I find this little note in Jerome fascinating. And what I have found out is that there's a specific thing at Caesarea where martyrdom and scribalism are connected and intricately connected because of Pamphilus, because of the school of Pamphilus. So you have the narrative of Pamphilus and his school and students' martyrdom in the Martyrs of Palestine, but we also have very interesting subscriptions to biblical texts from Pamphilus, working with a student, many of them with Eusebius, but others too. And what is interesting is that those little subscriptions, which say things like Pamphilus has corrected, Eusebius has collated, and the like. But what is interesting is that those little subscriptions very often are embedded in another subscription that is later and that preserved Pamphilus subscription. And there, in those later subscriptions, you can see the interest for the subscriber for the material aspect of the text that has been transcribed by the hand of Pamphilus the martyr. Of course, it's not expressed as strongly as in Jerome's note, but it is there. And then later also in different texts that are not related to Caesarea, you will find again and again this motif of the martyr scribe that proofreads the scripture and that is connected to martyrdom, that will, I don't know, I cannot tell if it comes from Caesarea, but this motif will reappear later in other writings. And if you're interested, I can send you a the piece I wrote about this.
Thanks very much. Is it specifically writings of martyrs like Pamphilius, or can we find a similar?
For this, no, yet. I mean, I suppose there are many. Let me think.
Or other charismatic figures would their works would have this special.
Well, in fact, there's a very interesting article by what's her name? Scholar from Vienna. Now the name. Yes, Claudia Rapp has written on this. She has a whole article where she shows the importance of the material aspects. And so of course, the biblical texts, the biblical manuscript, of course, are very important in the materiality, but she also shows that later on, even lives of saints as a material book start to have weight. I can also send you the reference if you like.
Thanks very much.
If I might add something, at least in one entry by Jerome on Damasus of Rome, we have graffiti as a literary genre, because he filled Rome with eulogies for martyrs and others as saints, and Jerome considers this as literature.
Yes.
Which is astonishing in its own right.
That's right.
We have time for more questions if anyone has. Okay, so I would like to ask kind of a follow-up question to Daniela's, but it's really a beginner's question, so excuse me in advance because some of us are really not familiar with the world of late antiquity. And again, about the material aspect of this transformation, you show very clearly how the information is transformed from one author to the other. But my question is about the different editions of these books, because obviously they existed long before print. And do you find cases in which things are changed within the text, like the order of the...
Which what? Sorry, I didn't hear. In which what?
I'm asking if you find editions that are different from one another in the way the different characters are presented, or the sequence is different, or one figure is omitted, or is it like sealed and transformed through the ages very neatly?
No, it's not, and you will have many changes. It's one thing that I would like actually to study more carefully in the future. But it's obvious, for example, in Gennadius, there are all the final entries in Gennadius are not considered authentic, and in the course of the text also there are one or two that are not considered authentic. They are considered as the interpolation of a 7th century individual. And the reason they're considered unauthentic is that they appear only in a minority of manuscripts. So there are differences, and they're definitely worth studying, because in fact, it's just as interesting as Gennadius or Jerome point of view. In the future, when I delve into this deeper, I would like to also, include that interpolator, because it's very interesting to see how it has traveled and how in the course of time in the manuscripts, you're right, things differ. It's a very important, that's the whole interest of the project. In fact, is to see how, this knowledge travels and how it is changed and modified according to circumstances and contexts.
Thank you. Okay, last chance for last questions, if anyone. Yes, Mo?
Yes, thank you. Sabrina, it's good to see you, and thank you
Hi,
for the
Mo.
lecture. Hi. I wanted to ask a question about the reception of the text. So you mentioned we have 176 manuscripts from Jerome's De Viris Illustribus, and I was wondering about the difference in the reader's perception of the different De Viris Illustribus. So can we tell So if Jerome and Eusebius and Gennadius had different aims in writing the text, is it reflectable in the reader? So for example, what is the text adjacent to? Can you see similarities or differences? What did they read it with? How did a medieval reader would perceive the difference between the different Deveris Illustribus, if that makes sense?
Differences about the readers. Well, I have to say that seems to me that for the three of them, it's a very elitist type of writing. Of course, there's a language difference between Eusebius and then Jerome and Gennadius. But I think that for the three of them, maybe more even for Jerome and Gennadius, socially speaking, not sure there are, similar people will be interested in reading it. I don't see how, it's going to be so different. The reader will be very cultured, and obviously the reader is not reading this to learn so much about these authors. I think it's a good question. It's a question of readership and of reception. We know, for example, that Jerome's Deveris Illustribus in the Carolingian period was used almost as a shopping list for libraries. So what do you want to include in your library? That's one type of reception. And again, it's not everybody is going to have access to this book, and not everybody is going to find interest in reading it. But in their period, it's all about these little circles, these little islands of intellectual scholars, very focused on their own intellectual world, I think. I am not sure, the place is changing, and of course the period is different, but from my perspective, I think it's pretty much the same people.
Okay, we have a question from Professor Joseph Weidin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sabrina. I think you made your case with regard to Gennadius and his subtle or less subtle way of putting southern Gaul on the map or in his list. I think that's clear. Would you say that he overstates his case? Or would you rather say, well, he had some material, so there is good reason to bring southern Gaul in such a list? There are a couple of interesting people around there in his own time and a little bit before him. So I would say it's not a complete fiction what he's doing. He works with Salvianus, whatever, people who have published things, who have written things. So he is, it's his good right, you could say, to do so. That's just a note. Another thing, more general observation was picking up on what has been said about materiality and this and that. Two scholars that I met on almost every page without having them cited, and you should not cite them maybe, that's Umberto Eco and Borges.
Of course.
And what you find there, and I think you can also say that this goes in certain sense for these ancient sources. When you talk about authors and you talk about libraries, there is a tension, but also a dynamics between materiality and fiction. Yeah, in a library, you have the impression that it's all there. And at the same time, you have to realize, I have not read 1/10 of what is there, maybe not 1% of what is there. So there is a kind of fictitious knowledge. Yeah, I know this, I know the book. Well, you've seen the book there and you know that it's a green cover, but you never read the book really. You never familiarized yourself with the book. So there is a tendency there to link the material presence of something with knowledge of it, which is to a certain degree true and to a certain degree fictitious, I guess. And that is a bit what you see here as well. you have a long list of people, and they all of them have written books and published books, and you get the impression as a reader of these catalogs that you know these people. Well, you know their name, and you know a couple of things, and you know a couple of titles, and maybe for some, to some level and for some occasions, that's enough. Yeah, but of course, when you want to become the specialist of that, it's not enough. You need to do more, of course. And so there is these dynamics inviting you to read these people. And on the other hand, the materiality, well, you never manage to do so because there's too much of it in a sense. And I think this is behind the whole project of writing such catalogs. You bring in things and you know that the reader who reads your catalog will never be able to read everything that you bring in. Just a comment.
Yes, you know, you're totally right about this. You know, there are several libraries competing, you know, the Uiris Illustribus. There is the material concrete library, which is at Caesarea, and then we have seen how it's also so important to Jerome. But you have also this sacred library that is scriptures, and then you have this Borgesian ideal library of all these authors of, but I think this concept maybe is less relevant here. I don't think that, I think it's the opposite, what's happening in this De Viris Illustribus. They're not dreaming. They're not dreaming of the ideal endless library of Borges here.
No, that's too far.
Yes,
too far.
but of course, you know, and it's funny you're saying this
because an element of fiction behind, I think. Yeah.
What did you say?
There remains an element of fiction behind. No one of these people can claim that they read all the books and authors that they mention, I think.
Well, I am not sure about this.
Yeah, maybe.
Because I think that, and I have to say maybe because it was the one that I knew the least, but Gennadius seems to be a lot more informed, and he claims so also, you know, that he's not quoting, he's not giving such a title because he hasn't read the book. And he's more involved in the contents. And because it's more doctrinal, it's he seems to be more knowledgeable. What you're just saying, what you just said about the libraries and also what they have read and not read, what we discussed with also Jeremiah, I think for Gennadius feels much more concrete than the other ones. He's more involved. And what was your first question? I forgot.
No, just this idea, putting Southern Gaul on the map. Is he overstating his case?
Yeah, about that.
Or does he have a good point to do so, good reason to do so?
Oh, he definitely has a good point to do so.
I would say so, yes.
Yes, he definitely, that's why I don't want to say that he is shaping this idea of Gallic literature. It's there, and he really rolls with the movement, but what he does is different from the others, because when you look at the table at the index and what he cites, and you see the dates of the authors and you see the region they come from, it's very clear that his purpose is very different. He's not at all, he's focusing on a shorter period, and he's focusing on mostly on those people in his geographical circle. And that's why I think also maybe he has really read them. You know, it's not just, you know, this fantastic universalist library. It's this very local, the people that he knows, the sources that he knows, and maybe he's more true to his work than Jerome and Eusebius.
I'm not completely convinced yet, but maybe you can convince me at another occasion.
Okay, we'll talk.
Okay, so this actually brings us to the end of our session here, and I would like to thank everyone, our audience, and especially Sabrina for this fascinating talk.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, for listening. It was great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you.
And see you in the next
Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag Sameach.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Chag Sameach, and thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you so much for attending. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.